There was a trickle, actually, relative to, let's say, Phnom Penh fell April 17th, 1975. Saigon fell April 29th, 1975, and then by December 75 was the Pathet Lao took over. So there was a very short period of time, and around the beginning of 1976, which is when we were finishing our Peace Corps service, there started to become refugees were coming across the border. A lot less Cambodians. I don't know if people are familiar with what had happened, but when Phnom Penh fell, a very terrible dictator named Pol Pot took over. I don't know if any of you have seen the movie The Killing Fields. Yes. So this was what we were dealing with. Cambodians who had been terribly brutalized, starved, separated from their families. So Rich said, when they came into Thailand, they didn't know where their families were at all. Many of the refugees coming in basically were farmers that had been living along the border area. And that's where these camps started. From Battambang and Siem Reap, they set up some camps along the borders. So there was a very small number. I think at that time there's about 6,000 refugees, Cambodians in Thailand. And generally, sometimes Rich and I went to the camp together, or more often than not, later when he became a big shot. I was traveling to the camps by myself with an interpreter. I had a driver, a Thai driver, a Cambodian interpreter, and me. And it was just, we had a very small group that did our processing. Unlike the Hmong camps that had big teams, I actually did remember working in Ban Vinai. I stayed at Muasu's thing with Charlie one time. So I had experience working in all the camps, but I primarily worked with the Cambodians. And that all kind of started to change. So from 76 through 78, very small numbers. At the end of 77, the Thai government stopped allowing refugees to come in. People were still coming, but they were called illegals. And we were not given access to resettle them in the U.S. because they were considered illegals, not refugees. So if you were in Thailand before the November of 77, you received refugee status. Most of the Hmong were in Thailand. We're in Ban Vinai or in the Hmong camps at that time, but very few Khmer had made it out. And this kind of all changed in January of 79. Mike mentioned the Vietnamese invaded and took over Cambodia. And so that opened the floodgates. And there was a tidal wave of refugees that started coming in from Cambodia in 1979. So this spurred some of the governments to organize. There was a big meeting, I think, in Geneva, and it was agreed that there would be tried an increase of resettlement numbers. We keep calling numbers. That's the number of people that countries will take. And fortunately, the U.S. program never kept pace with the numbers of people that needed resettlement. And so this effort was set up to have a second asylum camp. And that's when I mentioned I'd gone to the Philippines. There was a second asylum camp set up in order to accept people in Thailand, but if we couldn't get them into the U.S. that same year, they could go to the Philippines, learn some English, get some cross-cultural training, and wait till the numbers caught up. And that was later on when the government finally, our government and other governments finally all pitched in and agreed that we needed to really raise the acceptance levels for refugees. So just to clarify a little bit about IRC/JVA, some of you have heard this. There's a big alphabet soup of organizations, but most of the resettlement agencies are associated with church groups. There was Church World Service, there was IRC, the Lutheran Refugee Services, U.S. Catholic Charities. So there were 10 or 11 agencies that did resettlement of refugees. And IRC was one of those agencies, and they were the contracted agency for Thailand, to do processing in Thailand. And because the other agencies didn't want it all, the credit to go to just IRC, they said, you are representing all of us, so we are the joint voluntary agency. And that's where the term JVA came up, because we represented all of the agencies that were accepting refugees for resettlement. And in this case, other organizations did become the JVA. Yeah, I think Church World Service was the JVA in Malaysia. The International Catholic Migration Commission was the JVA in the Philippines. So that's where that comes up. IRC did have other programs in Thailand. You saw Dr. Roque in the CBS. He worked for IRC. They had a big medical program. They had a lot of they had nurses and doctors working in a number of camps. There was a nurse that worked in the Aranya Patek camp that I worked extensively in, and she was also with IRC. So IRC had a lot of good programs, and I think they're pretty active here in Sacramento as well. But that's the JVA part of why we have two names up there.